You there?
Hey, Peter, I think you put yourself on mute. We missed that last half.
Yeah, he's been having audio troubles. So, Peter, if you can hear me, just send me the info you want me to say.
Hey, Tim?
Peter,
Yeah.
can you send me what you need to say?
Can I say, just, what's that?
Can you send me what you want me to say?
Just introduce Dan Jennings and then just tell I don't have it exactly, but introduce the organization, represent NorCal chapter, and a plug for NorCal is pretty much it, is what I do. And Dan's going to be doing the questions during the presentation.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, sorry
All right,
about that,
should I
Tim.
go get started?
Yeah, please. Yeah, thanks.
All right.
Thanks.
All right, everybody, we're going to get started here. I'd like to welcome everybody to the NorCal Sports Turf Managers Association webinar Zoom meeting. Today, we have Dan Jennings from DuraEdge. He's going to go over the proper use of infield amendments and when you have to cut corners. So, Dan, I'm going to let you take it away. We're going to let Peter work on his audio, and then we'll come back. And if anybody has questions, you can raise your hand during the meeting or use the chat function at the bottom. So, Dan, go ahead and take it away.
Sounds great. Am I coming across okay on your end, Tim?
Yeah, everything sounds good, looks good.
Okay, I'm going to take the screen here and get this changed over. It's going to take probably take 20-30 seconds here for this PowerPoint to upload here. Peter, I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to your group. I appreciate the opportunity just to take kind of my years of experience as a groundskeeper and the years that I've had traveling the country, working on all types of fields, from little league fields to major league fields. I've worked right next to and side by side some of the greatest groundskeepers out there, and just am excited to take this information and, spread it along to hopefully help make life easier for you guys. My biggest talking points are going to be using data for you to make decisions. We're going to dive into that in greater depth. We're going to talk about soil structures and what makes up a soil structure. We're going to talk a little bit about top dressing materials, moisture management. Feel free to raise your hand for any questions that arise or pop up. I can see roughly, last I saw, there was 16 people on here. I can see 1, 2, 4. I can see 8 people. So if somebody raises their hand and I miss it, just say, "Hey, Dan, I've got a question," and definitely help walk through it a little bit. But working back through this PowerPoint here, talking about managing infield skins. My background, I started with the Great Lakes Loons as an assistant. That was in 2006, where we opened that ballpark. It's an affiliate of the LA Dodgers. So I was lucky enough to lean on Eric Hansen when he was with the Dodgers to take some of his knowledge and information and execute it up. And that's actually up in Midland, Michigan, which is a long ways away from us. And from there, I left to take a position with the Texas Rangers. Spent a couple seasons with the Texas Rangers. Was lucky enough where we went to the World Series back-to-back years. So that was a fun experience dealing with all of those headaches. I was just talking to the head groundskeeper of the Rockies this morning. He has the All-Star game this year.
Recording in progress.
We were talking about what's the biggest headache? Is it World Series games or is it All-Star games? Well, we both came to the conclusion that World Series games are much easier than All-Star games, because when you have All-Star games, you have every team and all of their media that shows up. They pretty much take over the warning track for 3 or 4 days while you're trying to get the field in shape. But from there, I transitioned into sales. After I left the Dayton Dragons, I did a full renovation with the Dayton Dragons. Was there for several years, and transitioned to national sales with Diamond Pro. Talking about a product called vitrified. There's vitrified shales, there's vitrified clays across the country, but using those as top dressing and the importance of those. We're going to dive into that a little bit here in this PowerPoint. But did that for about 6 years, and then had the opportunity to move my family out to Phoenix and build a new production plant for DuraEdge materials. So for people who don't know, we have a production site in Glendale, Arizona, Salt Lake, and also Denver. There's 2 more that are coming online here this fall that will make access to our bulk DuraEdge products more attainable here in the next few months. So we're excited to be expanding. Obviously, as a company, as a DuraEdge company, we're a long ways away from home. Home headquarters is in Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania. So it's taken us about 15 years to get this far, but we're really excited to be expanding, and just look forward to helping take some of our solutions to make your guys' life a little bit easier. Infield skins. What's the first thing that strikes your eye when you're watching a big league baseball game? Down here, I have a picture of actually a local high school field as an example, and I'm looking at this field, and the green grass pops out to me. I can see that this is some overseeded ryegrass that has some POA contamination coming in. Edges look really good, and obviously it's a beautiful backdrop. Those are some of the things that I quickly, take a look at when walking on a field. But is it the green grass that grabs your attention? Is it the, razor sharp edges? Is it the fun mowing patterns that groundskeepers are doing? Well, those are all things that viewers or fans see when they walk into the stadium. But as a player, especially an infielder, 70% of the game is played on the infield skin. So their attention is to how is that infield skin going to play today? Is it going to be consistent? Or am I going to have a long day of dealing with a hard playing surface or even a soft surface? Infield skins for the longest time have been considered managed as an art. And when you manage something as an art, it's very subjective. The way that somebody does it in New York could be completely different in how they do it in Florida, or they do it in Colorado, or even California. So without being able to have data, you're not able to have a predictable, replicable, or testable process when you're looking at infield mixes. As a company, DuraEdge has spent the last 15 years collecting this data all through the country so that when you're building an infield mix for, say, the New York Yankees or the San Diego Padres, those materials are the same materials that are leaving the door. It doesn't matter if it's leaving in Pennsylvania or if it's leaving the door in Phoenix. Those materials can be replicated because we are using soil test to provide us the product or the amount of sand, silt, and clay that we need to meet those levels. Now that data has been provided, now at the higher level, they can take it to the next level of going, how much moisture do I need in my infield skin to be consistent at a 7 o'clock game time? Or how much moisture do I need in my skin to have a safe G max for a playing surface? That's what we're starting to see at the college, and we're starting to see at the recreational level. Is data is now starting to drive the conversation. What is considered a soft infield mix that is safe to play on, that is soft enough when it dries out, but it's hard enough to be able to be resilient enough to play on? Those are a lot of big questions, and nobody's really taken the time to collect all of that data to have a supporting answer. Our team continues to work hard to help provide those answers and provide different types of testing methods that will support our industry to continue to drive it forward. Common traits of a good infield mix. As we said, traction's important, playability, resiliency. How quickly is it going to, how long is it going to hold up for the wear and tear if you're playing 3 games a day or if you're playing 1 game a day? The drainage, surface drainage is really important. We're going to dive into that a little bit. The appearance, some groundskeepers like a nice brown infield surface. Some groundskeepers like a red playing surface. So some of those can be adjusted with different top dressing materials, but appearance is obviously important. consistency. I was just talking about the importance of understanding the moisture in your infield skin for safety, for Gmax ratings. How can we make those consistent? Is it using soil sensors? Is it using a key or a knife like we've been doing for a lot of years? A lot of people will go out and they'll take their key and they'll poke it into the surface, and if they pull it up and it has soil on it, that means it's too wet and muddy, so it needs to dry out a little bit. Or if you can't get your key in, then that's usually a surface that is that's too dry and needs a little bit more moisture to hydrate it. Traction. We're defining traction as the footing. What type of base soil do you need to have proper footing? There's a line that's drawn in the sand that will tell you if you are too sandy. Obviously, your footing is going to slip or it's going to push out. If your infield has too much clay, then it's going to be really sticky when it's wet. If it has too much silt, then it's going to be really greasy and slimy on the surface. So those are all the things that you take a look at and you try to build definitions so that when you're taking this data, you can replicate it and have real conversations. Obviously, traction, part of the conversation is top dressing materials. 3/4 of an inch of top dressing material is usually going to be probably an unsafe surface to play on because top dressing materials are not made to lock together. They're made to be a specific gradation to manage the surface. So top dressing is really important when you're talking about traction. Moisture management. Moisture is the glue that expands the clay to hold on to all your other sand particles. So it's important that you have proper moisture so that that clay particle has something to grab a hold of to hold your whole soil structure together. Playability. Obviously, moisture is really important to how it plays. We have some different tests that we're hoping to be able to share here in the next few months of moisture and how the ball checks up when a ball hits it. How is it going to bounce based on forward momentum versus reverse momentum? Those are really big conversations. We want an infield to be as consistent as possible day in and day out. Now that's a little bit tougher at the lower levels, but there's different tools that can be used, like I call it dust control, but overhead irrigation to keep it hydrated when there's not enough staff to put water on it. Using materials that are a little bit higher in clay content so that the clay particle can hold on to moisture longer. There's some neat stuff that we're doing here at the spring training level in the desert, which obviously it's very arid here, of how to retain moisture as long as possible. So some of those studies will be coming out shortly as well. As you can see in my picture down here, there was top dressing on top of this surface, so everything looked really smooth and looked really consistent. But as you can see, as it was broomed away, there was material that was not. This material wasn't bonded together. It was a combination of some organic binder breaking down, leading to some shelving, which shelving means two materials that aren't binding together They want to slip and fall apart. That's called shelving, or that's called chunking out of an infield surface. We talked a little bit about resiliency here, but a lot of this has to do with how long are these surfaces going to be able to withstand the wear and tear. You know, there's a lot of wear at first base. There's a lot of wear at your position areas. If it's a field that has 4 or 5 games played on it a day, it's going to be important that that the soil is structured correctly, that you have the right sand, silt, and clay in it so that it can take that traffic all day long. And this will help with the material not wearing, or your surface grade not wearing out as quickly, and having those low ruts, which is going to cost labor and extra time to dry out. Those areas that wear out are areas that when it rains are obviously going to become bird baths. And usually those are the areas that continue to wear out because of dragging material out of there when it's wet, or adding a whole lot of drying agent to those materials and raking it in. I mean, drying agent is a really, really fine material, and it works really well to dry up puddles. But as soon as that material is done being used, it needs to be removed because it falls into the very fine to the upper coarseness of silt when you're looking at particle sizing, and can lead to a lot of disruption issues in your playing surface. I don't know if you've ever been on an infield skin that was wet and there was a lot of drying agent put on those areas, but it gets to the feeling like it's really jelly. And so it's just not structured to be able to withstand moisture. So if you're going to use those materials, I recommend using them to dry those areas up, but to get rid of them. The larger particles, those materials do hold up longer and can be reused. So I always push people to stay away from the drying agent and really stick to a coarser gradation that you can use to dry those areas up, but can also be dragged afterwards for you to redistribute through the infield skin. Talking a little bit definition of drainage. So infield skins, they're not made to infiltrate like you see with a root zone, like an infield skin root zone, or I'm sorry, like an infield grass area or an outfield grass area. A native root zone will drain between 3 to 7 inches an hour, roughly. A USGA root zone, which is used at the higher levels, those will infiltrate at 15 to 17 inches an hour once sod is placed on top of them. So those areas are really, really good at infiltrating moisture and nutrients because of the porosity in them. But infield skins, because of, you're talking really fine particles, that once those are compacted, you're not going to see an infiltration rate. You're going to see an infiltration rate of about 0.5 inches an hour, which is very, very slow. So when you're talking about trying to hydrate a 4 or 6 inch column and get moisture all the way through it, it is a slow, gradual process to get that moisture to leach through that whole column. So that's where at the recreational level of being able to have dust control and irrigation system, water at night or water a couple times during the day, will allow you to keep that column full and to supplement your moisture as you need to have a safe playing surface. Obviously, at the higher levels, it's a lot easier. Those guys drag a hose out 2 to 3 days before the homestand, and they flood the surface and allow that moisture to fall down through the profile. And as it does, they'll come out and put more water on it and allow it to infiltrate down through that profile. And it's a steady process to get it through the 4 to 6 inches, depending on how deep their profile is, to have a safe playing surface. And during the game, what they're shooting for is as that moisture falls during first, second, third, fourth inning, there's enough moisture in there that it's staying hydrated so they can have consistent playability. Now, in some different regions of the country where there's a higher dew point, you'll actually see a reverse hydraulic pull. You'll actually see the moisture start coming up to the surface. So depending on temperatures and time of play and year of play, those are all things to think about. The one thing, and I may be getting ahead here of my slides, but I want to talk about it before I forget about it. The biggest thing that data allows you to do is to have a conversation at a higher level with your ownership group. I have my first 2 degrees is in accounting and econ, and those degrees allowed me to have a conversation with my CFO and my CEO at a level of financial cost. And by taking this type of data, these soil tests, nutrients test, if you're talking soil, nutrients test, but I'm able to take those tests and have a conversation of why I need to spend money on something, and where I'm going with that data to save money down the road, or if it's one of those where it's an ROI, where there's a return on my investment, where it could be as simple as what we see here in the spring training complex. We switched a spring training complex over to our infield or our mound clay material, and based on his calculations, he's going to save about $10,000 a spring training season because the material is holding up. It has a higher level of plasticity in it. So he's not going through as much material. He's not going through as much labor to take care of that material. The material is staying in place and doing exactly what it's supposed to do. So there's the conversation of, a 3 to 5 year ROI to talk through that data and give you something to explain that's tangible to upper management. I'm going to take a quick second. Any questions until we have one more, and then we're going to jump into another thought. But any questions at this point? I'll keep moseying along here. This is the last thought of being able to take data and put it under definitions. And the last definition here is consistency, and we're defining that as a function of management practices to bring consistency to something. Obviously, moisture has to do with this. Material has to do with this. This consistency is obviously going to bring confidence to the players that are performing on it. It's going to allow them to step their level up. And I think that's what we're seeing right now in the conversations that we're having, is because as a company, we started at the highest level, and we've slowly transitioned as we've grown as a company down to the collegiate level and recreational level and all of that. But what we're seeing is that that performance at the major league level is transitioning down to the collegiate level. And you see some of these new collegiate ballparks and ultimately facilities that they're building is stepping up the game. Now, collegiate moves down to high school. High schools are doing the same thing. I know they just spent a massive bond here in Phoenix. And the biggest conversation was, we have not spent any money on these fields in the last 20 years. How much is it going to cost to take us to the next level? What's it going to cost for us to go a level above that, so that if they have to wait another 20 years, they don't fall more than 2 levels behind? And there's ways of doing that, and having conversations using data to justify why spending X amount of money will put them at a higher level versus always kind of playing catch up. As you know, infield skins need to be laser graded. Depending on the level of play, they need to be tilled so that all those materials are blending together. But if you're not doing proper maintenance and using top dressings to protect those surfaces, in 5 years, when you go to spend the money on that same infield skin, if you haven't invested the time to take care of those lips and edges, that's going to be a lot more expensive than, maybe at year 3, you had a company come in and do the laser grading and tilling and kind of help stay on it. That'll help keep from the lips building up. And we're going to dive into that a little bit here, or in a few slides, of staying on top of the maintenance so that your cost doesn't continue to build. And next thing you know, in year 5 and year 6, you're spending a tremendous amount just to get caught back up where you had not put the money into it in year 1, 2, and 3 on just normal maintenance practices, which allowed that field to go south in a hurry. Now the justification on year 5 to redo all of the work is, in some people's mind, it's really frustrating. So trying to get ahead of that and have really good conversation of maintenance practices and how those are going to be executed moving forward is important in every level, major league, recreational, whatever level it is. Soils vary widely across the country, but there are general recommendations that can be used to be used as guidelines when choosing an infield soil. Like I said, I've seen infield mixes from New York to Florida to Seattle to San Diego and all in the between. I do have a lot of soil knowledge from my years with Michigan State, and a lot of these materials, if they are just local materials that are dug out of the ground, those materials have veins, and those clay sources will change. You can jump from one vein to another vein and have a infield mix that is a 60-20-20 in one vein, and then right next to it, it could be a 70% sand, 15% silt, 15% clay, which is not a horrible a horrible material. But you have 2 driving factors: is you do not have any inconsistency by digging it straight out of the ground. You don't have the ability to make any adjustments to it to make it to bring the ROI value of that material up. So those are things to think about. Obviously, engineered infield mixes is fairly new to the industry, but we have been engineering soil since I think 65 or 68 when the USGA came out with their soil standard of the USGA root zone. So soil blending's been going on for a long time. Just a little new when it comes to infield mixes. The other thought of veins of material is understanding your clay source. Clay is measured in microns. Clay sizing is 2 microns to infinity microns. So understanding what size your clay particle is that you're putting into your infield mix will be a huge conversation when you're talking the corkboard effect. Clay particles, they expand when they have moisture, and based on the size of that clay particle, it'll expand differently. So that's a big conversation. We as a company have collected a lot of data on that topic, and at this point we have not shared that data to the masses, but it is something that we're looking to have a greater conversation as a whole with. Here's some examples of an unbalanced soil structure. So these are cases where there's too much silt or there's too much clay, which means that there's not enough sand to build void spaces for the silt and clay to sit in. So when you have that, you have your sand that builds the soil structure, and anything that is not in, a ratio, that once those void spaces fill, they go to the top. So what goes to the top is, in some cases, could be silt, some cases could be clay, but this leads into a lot of playability issues. The first picture outlines 2 materials that were not blended together very well, and you can see some separation. That's what happens when new material is added and they're not tilled or scarified together. You'll get this separation of materials. In the second picture, this is an area where obviously I think picture 1 and 2, or 2 and 3, show where it's probably greater than 1% surface fall, which is great that there's good surface drainage. But once you get above 1%, it's usually a little too fast, and you lead into some migration issues. Most infield skins are being recommended to be at roughly 0.33 to as high as 0.75 on surface drainage percentages. And this also helps so that you're not having material run into your edges. This is a nice valley that just leads into materials washing into this back edge, so that down the road, they're going to have to replace that edge to make sure that they're staying on grade and that's not growing. We'll talk about that in a minute. Here's a great example of soil structure versus unstructured. As I was just saying, once the sand void space is filled, the clay and silt will rise to the top. And if it's silt is usually really dusty. Clay is really dusty as well, but those particles are really fine. And so when a player or somebody goes to slide into a base, you can see all of this distribution of the base material sliding all over the place, leading to a low area that needs to be worked on. Below is an infield soil that is structured, and because it's structured and has enough void space for all the silt and clay to fall into, all you see is the top dressing material sliding all over the place. This obviously leads to a situation where that sliding pit area is going to need less maintenance. so that all you're doing is adding a little bit of top dressing material or distributing the top dressing material, and you're ready to play ball. I dove into this a little earlier. So some of this I've kind of already picked through, but when you're choosing an infield mix, usually a standard infield mix profile is 4 to 6 inches in depth. Obviously should pack fairly tightly when it's hydrated, and able to loosen it up when you're trying to till it. Infield mixes should be at least screened down to a 1/4 inch. I've seen even at the major league level where some of these procedures haven't been followed. It was several years ago, but so back to the conversation of engineered versus local quarry material. When you're engineering an infield material, you're running it through a multi-level mixing unit. Most of them are called plug mill systems. But what these are they're putting a percentage of the correct sand, the correct amount of silt and clay, and blending those together so that you have a consistent material every time you put it out on your surface. Compared to a local quarry, which could lead to 2 different types of materials based on what year or what area of the vein they pulled those materials off. Now, I have seen local quarries that are very consistent and test very, very well. And in those situations, it makes a lot of sense to have a good conversation of, is that the right material for you? There are local materials that are able to stay consistent. There's pluses and minuses depending on where those materials are being mined out of. But those are definitely options to look at and have a good conversation about, because once you start blending materials, obviously you have operational costs that drive that. You drive the cost of that material up. So depending on the ROI situation, it may make sense to find a local quarry. What I found out here on the West Coast is the biggest battle is dealing with the sodium buildup and the bicarbonates and how that's going to be managed in local quarries. There's a couple big topic conversations going on how to attack those and continue to make those fields better. There's been a lot of organic binders used, which organic binders have a place, but binders hold a structure together that do well until they are mechanically broken down with could be UVA sunlight, or it could be salts and just standard maintenance. So understanding soil structure and how those are being held into place is going to help justify the ROI when you're buying materials and during your next renovation. Questions. We're going to jump into what an infield skin is made up of. We're going to jump into particle sizing, and we're going to get into the science a little bit more in greater depth. So hopefully nobody's falling asleep. Some of us love this soil stuff, but it can become monotonous. All right. I don't see any hands. All right. Infield mixes. they're made up of, you know, sand, silt, and clay. I always recommend that you you adjust your infield mix material based on your maintenance level. So if you're in a situation at the major league level, they have the highest level of maintenance capabilities. So they can deal with the higher clay content that comes along with it. The more clay content that you have in an infield mix, the more moisture you can hold, which is fantastic to give them the ability to have plasticity and deal with a lot of the play from bigger players and to have consistency. It works really well. But at the lower levels where maintenance levels are a lot lower, budgets are much lower, it's usually one or two guys probably taking care of the field. It's recommended to reduce your clay content and increase your medium-sized sand. Medium-sized sand is measured from very coarse to medium. Like to see those numbers right around 45%, 40 to 45% overall volume of the soil. But that's going to help increase in the medium-sized sand will give you more void space to fill the silt and clay, but going with a little bit more sand will leave sand on the surface to soften it a little bit. So softball really likes to have a little bit softer playing surfaces. So those are things that can be mechanically blended to offer those different types of solutions. This leads into the next conversation of being able to amend your current surface. After you take it to the soil test and the soil lab presents you with testing, we can now take a look at that soil test, and because of engineering tools, we can adjust and customize the blend to help take your current infield skin to the next level. By taking it and, you know, helping meet a certain maintenance level, which we'll talk about in a minute, this will help for the material to withstand the amount of play that you have, which is going to generate ROI and help make life a little bit easier and safe for the players. So it's hard to sometimes have a conversation and put things in perspective when you're talking about microns. Very coarse sand is measured from 1 to 0.5 millimeters, which is, I believe, 2,000 microns. You step down into medium-sized sand, it's 0.5 to 0.25 medium-sized sand. Medium-sized sand is 1,000 microns. 1 micron is the width of your hair. So 1 micron, once we get into medium-sized sand, we're talking about particles that are smaller than the width of your hair. And between coarse sand and medium-sized sand, these sand particles are used to build your structure so that the silt and the clay has room to fill that void space. These sand particles are going to stack. They're going to stack on top of each other, just like best way to explain is like a blocking system, and provide void space for the silt and clay to fall into. So once you get into silt, you're talking 25 microns to 2 microns. And then clay is 2 microns to infinity microns. So these materials are really, really small, but the coarse and the medium-sized sand is going to build your overall structure of your infield mix. And this is all done at the engineering level and has been done for many, many years. We do this, my family owns a construction company. Before we build houses, we need to take a look at the soil to make sure that we can put that particular type of foundation on top of it. So this conversation right here is nothing new, a little new to the industry, but besides that new. So sand particles, recommended range is 60 to 75% depending on level of maintenance. Higher amounts of sand for lower levels of maintenance. That's where having a little more sand on top gives you a little more cushion. It's all sand particles are not considered equal. There's beach sand, which is very round. And then there's angular sand that is obviously very sharp. So finding a sand that fits into that medium to very coarse, that is subangular, is very, very important, because if it's too angular, the material is going to become, it's going to be way too hard once it actually sets up. Those materials are going to stack on top of each other and become a very, very hard playing surface. So having a little subangular to those sand particles will make a huge difference when you're talking infield mixes. Different climates is obviously going to lead to different types of material recommendations. What we do here in Phoenix, where it's really arid, is going to be different than what we do in Northern California. I'm sure a lot of you guys know my counterpart on the operational sides, Cam Toon. He's done a lot of work up in that Northern California area, and we really take a look at annual percentage, and when that rain is coming. And we have conversations based on maintenance levels of what material should be going in to each facility. Here's a good picture of a soil structure that has too much silt. And a quick way to know that it has too much silt is obviously the sand is all underneath this base. And when somebody goes to stand on it, the material comes spewing outside of the shoe. This is standard, very fine sand to coarse silt situation. If it was really high in clay, then this material would have stuck to the shoe and it wouldn't have pushed up around it. So those are quick ways to know maybe what type of material you have or you're dealing with without sending it to the soil or sending it to the lab. But recommendations cannot be made until that soil test is completed. Silt is recommended between 15 and 20%. Always looking at a 1-to-1 ratio between your silt to clay. This helps bridge the overall void space that the sand's providing. So if you have too much silt, it'll lead to silt. Once all the void space is filled, it'll lead to silt sitting on top, which will lead to a greasy playing surface. And if it's clay, if you have excess clay that goes on top of that column, it's going to be really sticky when it's wet. So those are all the things to think about, look at. Clay is in the same spectrum. You're looking at 15 to 25% clay content based on regional areas and playability, but it comes down to that 1-to-1 ratio between silt and clay. Clay is a little more unique because clay is the glue once it's hydrated that holds these structures together. So it's definitely important to understand moisture and moisture management. Soil testing. Obviously, I dove into this right after my introduction, but soil testing is what's driving this industry forward and allows us to have conversations to justify upcoming cost. It doesn't matter if it's redoing a root zone and tearing 4 inches out, bringing 4 inches in and tilling it all together to provide a really good root zone. Or if it's a infield mix situation where the soil test goes out and comes back and says that sand levels are extremely high and silt and clay needs to be added to it to bring it back into balance. So soil testing justifies the reason to make the next step. And that's the nice thing of being able to lean on science to do this. And it's not speculative decision-making, which chief financial officers can't stand anything that's speculative. So being able to present data and reasons why usually allows things to move forward and to have better conversations, or at least set a forecast of possibly when things can change. Different type of soil testing I recommend is the ASTM 422 or the ASTM 1632. The 1632 is it's the cheapest option. It's usually $40-50 depending on who you have do it. This is a straight sieve test. I think they hold it in solution maybe for a couple hours, but this material is a pretty straightforward test. The 422, they hold that material into solution close to 24 hours. I think the final number is like 16 to 18 hours is standard testing procedures. But this allows you a better look at your fine particles, because the longer the sample sits in the solution, the better that the material can separate, so that you can really have a really good look at all of the particles that make up the infield mix. I'm going to check for questions, and then I'm going to transition. I wasn't able to get this to work on this slide, so I'm going to transition to another page to watch this process, I think. Here we go. Okay. I don't know how many people have heard about the using a jar to test their soils, but you can use a jar in most situations, and you can shake it up and take a look at your sample and make a percentage off of it. It's as simple as taking, I don't know what size this jar is, probably a 12 or 16 ounce jar, filling it with a water solution and filling half of it up with your soil sample, shaking it up and letting it dispense for 2 to 3 days. And then now you can take measurements and find your percentage of, there's some obviously sand at the bottom, finer sand on top of that, silt, and then clay on top, is a quick, easy way to do a soil test. We've always called this process kind of marbles in a jar, but what it is obviously particles vary in several different sizes. The sand particles are the larger particles in the solution. Those are going to settle first because of their density. They're going to create the void space. Your smaller particles are going to fill, are going to fill those void spaces. You can see the silt and clay that's falling in between those particles. So this just goes into the definition a little bit of sand particles. We were talking about this earlier. Obviously, one sand is not created equal. There's subangular, there's subrounded. If the sand particle is too rounded, it obviously is going to resist compaction. This is what you see in beach sands. When you go to step on it, it disperses. If it's too angular, you're going to see compaction. It's going to lock up and become very, very hard because those sand particles are angular. They're going to sit on top of each other and not give. So too angular and too rounded is not a good combination for a good infield mix. As you can see, how the recommendation of particles should be in this distribution is you have your very coarse, which is the larger blue particles. You have your coarse particles, your coarse sand particles, which are the medium-sized blue ones. And then you fall into your medium-sized sand, which is these little purple ones, I believe. Maybe that's the fine sand. But having a nice even distribution of these sand particles allow you to build a solid foundation for the next step. And that next step is your silt and clay that's going to be worked into your soil structure. Here's kind of the outline of the conversation of what is ideal for each level. Obviously, the professional part is easy. They have a lot of maintenance. They have capabilities of watering. So based on their maintenance level, the recommendation is between 58 and 62% of overall sand volume. And 40% of that needs to be greater or equal than medium-sized sand. So medium-sized sand is defined as very coarse, and medium-sized sand when you look at a soil test. And I'm going to show a soil test here in a minute. Your silt to clay combination needs to add together to be 38 to 42% with a silt to clay ratio of 0.5 to 1. Yeah, here's an intermediate level of maintenance. This is kind of what we'll see at the college level is obviously an increase in sand percentage is recommended. Increase of medium-sized sand is increased. Silt to clay comes down. But with the increased sand, this is obviously going to soften it a little bit to make it a little bit easier to maintain. And silt to clay ratio still between 0.5 and 1. The recreational level, which is pretty much no water, very little maintenance, those numbers are now recommended between 70 and 75%. Medium-sized sand right there in the 50%. Silt and clay is obviously going to come down because silt and clay is what's going to drive and make these infield skins harder. So bringing that number down, but with continuing with the silt and clay ratio when building those soil structures. So I brought this back up because I'm going to dive into what a soil test looks like. Biggest question that has to be asked is what level of maintenance is your playing surface? And in this case, this one that we're going to use this soil test, it's a high school, it's in the Midwest, it's imbalanced base soil. It's 1.5 inches below grade after the field is shot. No access to water, and volunteers are taking care of it. So this falls right into, obviously the recreational recommendation for this particular playing surface. But as you can see, the soil test comes back and 47.2% fall into the sand column. 45.4 falls into the silt column. 7.4% falls into the clay content. Obviously, to break that out, we're very interested in the medium, coarse, and very coarse sand sizing, because that's what's going to build the soil structure column for the silt and clay to fill in. We want this number to be right around 45 to 50%. As you can see, this particular field is far from that, and it actually has very fine, or has fine and very fine sand particles, which leads to a whole lot of other issues of playing surface. So the goal in this particular situation is we want to drive the very fine and the fine sand particles down. And so I just walked through this, but as you can see, with doing the silt to clay ratio, which is as simple as silt divided by clay, we come out with a silt to clay ratio of 6.14. That means there's 6.14 times more silt than there is clay. The goal is to have 0.5 to 1. So that's the first thing that needs to be addressed when amending this infield skin, is we need to push that silt number down while increasing the clay content so that we can balance that silt to clay ratio. As I was discussing, we were hoping to have this medium-sized sand in the 45 to 50%. Right now it's at 10.6, and very fine sand is at 16.3. I'd like to see this around 5, 2 to 3, but 5 is fine. So just walking through this, we were showing the soil test of 47 and where ideal was for that soil test. So the ideal situation for a recreational infield mix is driven based on soil testing, 70 to 75% sand, silt to clay of 25 to 30, silt to clay ratio of 0.5 to 1, and medium-sized sand greater than 50. So this is what we're shooting for with making an amendment. Now, the next step is, okay, this is what a jar test would look like. If you were to do a jar test on this particular type of material, it would look like this. The sand particles are sitting on the bottom, and because there's so much silt, the silt is being pushed to the top with little bitty clay particles and some very fine sand particles, but you can see the soil is imbalanced. There's not enough void space to fill in the silt and clay, and all the very fine is sitting on top. So all of this is acting just like that skin that we saw earlier. The material is being distributed around the shoe. During an amendment, obviously the goal is to rebalance that. We need to increase the overall sand, increase the overall clay content. Medium-sized sand will ultimately come up as we drive the silt down and increase the clay because of using USGA sand or a 2 mil sand. That is going to be the catalyst of producing enough void space for all of these materials to sit in. In this case, this material called for 50% sand and 50% silt and clay to make the adjustment. It's pretty much in a situation of going out with 25 tons and tilling it in two to three directions, rolling, grading, and restructuring that infield to make sure that it's balanced. So let's take a look at, we saw what was the test before. let's look at the test afterwards. So after that 25 tons was tilled in and a soil test was taken, this high school, we took the sand particle sizing to 72.5%. We took the silt, which was at 45%, and we brought it down to 15%. The clay, we took from, I think it was like 6 or 7%. We drove it up to 12.5. So we were almost able to balance our silt to clay ratio by doing 25 tons worth of an amendment. This silt to clay ratio puts us at a 1.2, and our silt to clay ratio originally was 6.14. So just to get it closer to that balance, using 25 tons is pretty, it's pretty amazing. So what would happen is next year, we would take this same soil test and we would make the next amendment until we found the perfect balance where we could continue to go out with the same material year after year. The very fine was, I believe, in the 16%. And this was driven down to 4% very fine. The medium-sized sand was sitting at 10%. It was driven up to 56.9%, which puts us in an ideal situation where we have more void space than we do silt and clay. So now this silt and clay has a place to sit in this medium-sized sand cavity. Here's a good picture of the before and the after. Take the time to, take a look at this. This is a pretty good swing. As we were, this is not the before, this is just the after and meeting the ideal recreation or the ideal recreational maintenance level. You can see those numbers are a lot closer to where they need to be. And actually most of them are hitting right where they need to be after one amendment. So there was a change in overall sand content of 25%. There was a change in medium-sized sand of almost 50%. Pushed the very fine sand down to 12% and pushed the silt down almost 30, well, pushed it down 30.4%. So after that, you have a before skin that is not balanced, and you have silt and clay at the top, unsafe, unplayable after rain situation, versus after you have a balanced soil structure that has the right sand in it, the right silt and the right clay to now bring ROI to allow that field to be played on more, hold more moisture when needed, and to help save on labor so that areas aren't wearing out as quickly as they would normally. Most of the time we're seeing a type of savings like this. If we were to remove that 4-inch column and put a new 4-inch column, it would be about $40,000. If we were to amend that infield, bring 25 tons in, till it all together, add, till it, grade it, roll it, do a final grade, add top dressing, it's about $15,000. That's a pretty big savings. I'm going to transition back over to the other PowerPoint, but are there any questions at this time on that topic? I covered a lot there.
I just want to say something, Dan, that the majority of the mixes that I've tested in Northern California are right along the lines of that 7 to 10%. So we're adding that FS50 majority of the times. And it's for these guys that are on here, it's a really good cost-effective way. Like he said, you'll need to remove 4 inches of your mix in order to get that. But when you're amending and you're just amending that top 2 inches, I mean, it's made a world of a difference on the maintenance side, holding water and just not having that product move as much, because that's the problem with most of our mixes around here is they're blowing into left field or right field, and that product helps make that infield stay. So the days of buying a truckload every year are not as prevalent.
You know, that I didn't bring that up, Jim, but that's the other thing is once you have a balanced infield skin, unless you have excess play where you're playing 300-400 games a year on a field, then it really shouldn't need maintenance until year 5 or 6. The biggest maintenance it's going to need is to be, you know, retilled and reblended to, you know, reset the distribution of those sand particles. Because as you know, when you put really fine particles in a solution with really big particles like sand, it'll push that sand to the top. So it needs to be blended together so it's homogeneous every, you know, 3 to 5 years. But besides that, you shouldn't be adding material once you build a structure that's in place. There are situations where, you know, lips do build up, so it is going to come up a little bit. But you know, we're one of the few. DuraEdge is one of the few companies that will not install infield mixes if the lips are not correct, because adding material and building a platform where eventually that platform is all going to be removed, it's a waste of money.
Hey, Dan,
Yes, sir.
do you adjust it all around the clay bricks area, around pitcher's mound or not so much up at home plate when you do the infield mix, or you use a separate product for that? Like you mentioned before, you taking the mound mix and putting that in the infield.
It's a good question. Most of the time, it's usually just taking the standard infield mix and using that around your less high traffic areas. Those are going to be, you know, you'll manage those kind of just like you do with your infield skin. So whatever material that you're amending on your infield mix, you're going to amend your baselines. And I usually recommend just amending your home plate while you're doing it. Most of the time what I see is usually there's not a quality mound clay being installed. So it's a perfect time to go in and, you know, put a quality mound clay material in there so that it's going to, you know, withstand the traffic and you're not going to go through as much material. But if it's already in place, I would just amend it just like you do with everything else. Is that all of them? Let me click through names real quick. Okay. We are creeping up. Ooh, so 114. I'm only halfway through this. Well, we'll continue moving. So why is this important? Obviously, safety, playability, functionality, cost savings. Those are all really, really important when trying to justify why we spend money as a department. And I apologize. I've got 2 twins that are 6 months old. They're a little fussy. They're just waking up from naps. So apologize if you hear them in the background. Mama's doing a good job, but they're busy. But justifying why we spend money as a CFO or somebody who looks over the finances of this department, they look at this department as a red line because it's all money that's going out the door and it's not being recouped. Now, there's been people that have learned how to bring more value to their department all over the country, which obviously has helped them continue to grow and build a little bit better of a budget, but justifying everything that needs to be spent and why it needs to be spent. What I'm seeing is that if there is data that is supporting what needs to be done and a actionable layout over the next 5 years of what that looks like, most people with the financial checkbook is going to move forward. Now, we're in a little bit unprecedented time with COVID and coming out of a lot of craziness. So it'll be interesting to see what the next couple of years brings to, our industry and ultimately the world, but nor here, nor there. Here's the blending process and what it looks like. 25 tons was top dressed out on this surface, and then a reverse tine tiller. This is a black reverse tine tilled it in two. I think this field was actually 4 directions, but sometimes it does go a little higher than that, depending on how much moisture was in the profile when these were being blended together. This is what happens when materials are not blended together, and you can see where these were not scarified together or blended together, and you're seeing some shelving or some chipping leading to an unsafe area. So making sure materials are being tilled correctly is important. Obviously, this leads into the big conversation of why engineered soils have taken off up in the Midwest. Obviously, in the spring, it is not fun to play baseball. I grew up in Michigan. I played 4 years of baseball and 4 years of college baseball. And it is no fun playing in cold, rainy, wet, snowy conditions. But more games are being played now because these structures are being built to stay in place. And the conversation around what particles are in that soil structure is making the industry better and allowing more games to be played, and hopefully continues to keep artificial away from coming into the industry. But that's a big conversation as well. Here's a soil structure that's sticky, a little high in clay, it's sticking to his shoes. Here's a soil structure that's a little higher in silt. You can see it's pushing out around his edges of his feet, pretty slick and unsafe. So those are quick ways to walk on a field and see what it looks like. Drainage is really important. And I think I'm going to, just looking at where I'm at in this whole conversation. I'm going to skip this. Drainage is important, but it's a big conversation for another day. Lips are very, very important to manage with a good backpack blower or a broom. Lip management is a reason a lot of these fields fail, is lips build up and you keep adding material, and next thing you know, there's a plateau. And once that field needs to be brought back into shape, most of the time, all that infield has to be removed and brought down to grade. So you're wasting material, or it's material that's been paid for that won't be used for a little while. So lip maintenance, all of this, all of these lips can be, figured out with walking your field. You should be able to walk the field. As they say, you should be able to walk a field blindfolded and not feel the transitions from the infield grass to the infield dirt. Obviously, all situations change that, but here's a nice way of breaking up an edge that has a real compacted clay lip is sharpening a garden rake and raking through it. I used to use a Ryan cedar and take the seed out, and used to cut my edges if I needed to soften them, and then take a hose through them. And this looks really aggressive, but that's a pretty fine mist. And he's just washing some of that material away. Worst case scenario, you have to resod all your edges. Usually comes out to 9,000 square feet of sod. And all edges need to be cut down to rematch to the grade of the infield surface and keep that safety. It's a lot easier to put grass in here. It's a lot cheaper than it is to continue to add material and then eventually have to take all this material out to match the original grade. I'm going to, I think I'm going to leave it there, Peter. We covered a lot. Obviously, there's still a lot to cover. But any questions for me? Maybe I can help go through. I'd like talking everything from soil to growing grass to the accounting's office if we need to.
There's probably a couple of days worth of material on it, right, Dan?
It's nonstop. It's fun to see how people do things differently, and then take that information and share it with others so that they can take it and make of it as their own. You know, take a little bit here, take a little bit there. And that's the nice thing of what STMA has done, is it's brought us all together as an industry so that we all can learn from each other.
Right. I know in our environment at the school district, you know, like I had mentioned in our emails to you, we, like a lot of the people in the industry, take we're very prideful in the work that we do and want to make sure that we are giving a product to our players as a safe product. But we have to cut corners. You know, we're not the ability to get out there and groom them like we would, but that's pretty much, I think your presentation really helped us a bunch as far as where to cut corners and the most feasible way to do that. So that was very helpful. Do you find that with the drought situation and climate change that your product has changed quite a bit over the years?
The raw material that we mine, that material hasn't changed. The sand particle sizing is pretty standard across the country, and because it is all, you know, run through screens and it's all tested, it's allowed us to to bring consistency, which has allowed us to bring the data to the industry because it is consistent. Everybody's having the same conversation. You know, if this infield's the same as infield and, you know, down the street, now we can talk about, hey, soil moisture reading device in my skin, and it's saying it's 20%. That seems really good. And then maybe somebody down the street saying, well, mine's 40, and it seems to be a little bit safer. More efficient, becoming more transparent. Across, I think transparency. There was no data to be able to provide to our CFO of why we need to spend the money on mound clay or top dressing,
Right.
Besides it rain. That'll get rid of all of the top dressing That'll remove that, and maybe any top dressing that's broken down, it'll remove that. And then take 3 inches out of the column and send that out to your soil lab. If you're going to send it in and do a great big soil test, then I recommend taking at least 4 samples out of each half of the infield skin. So that'd be 4 samples on the first to second base area, and then 4 samples on the second to third base area. Put it in a 5-gallon bucket, mix it all together, then send in a gallon-sized baggie to allow them to run their analysis.
This is for like the when you add the water, though, is what I'm asking. When you add the
Yep.
water to the mason jar. So if you're going to do it at home, exactly, or within our office, you put all the soil sample or your sample in the soil in the mason jar, and you add the water. How much of a material should you put in there?
I put 3 inches in there. I take that 1/2 inch off and then take 3 inches, maybe I would fill at least 3 inches into your mason jar, because you're going to want an even number. When you put it in the mason jar, I would put it in the mason jar first so you can measure. If you go 3 inches, now you can use that number when you're all said and done to build your percentage of each material. It's a lot easier to use a divisible of 3 than it is of like 3 point,
Yeah, sure. Okay,
3.25 or something.
makes sense. Okay, all right, understand. Are any questions from anybody else? Dan, I really appreciate you doing this presentation. It's been very, very helpful. This is going to be recorded and for future reference in our YouTube, and DuraEdge, great product. I use it here in our district and so forth. And Dan Jennings' contact information is on our website. It'll be up there for quite a while. And Dan, once again, thank you very much, and taking the time out, and good luck with your 2 daughters, is it?
2 boys, yeah.
2 boys. Okay, that's a lot of work. So congratulations. Good luck to you on that.
It's a blessing and a handful. I appreciate the opportunity, Peter, and anybody, don't hesitate to call. I enjoy sharing the information, and DuraEdge allows me the opportunity to do that. So however we can help, we're excited to be here.
Okay. Thank you again, Dan. Appreciate it. Have a good one. Take care.